debt tends to increase historically during periods of war, whether or not we're talking about the Crimean War, the Napoleonic Wars, World War I, World War II. And then it looks like in most instances, if you were to draw a sort of an average line, that it tends to fall in periods of peace. But then one of the things we see in more recent history, particularly since the turn of the century, is a massive increase in the amount of debt that the government is taking out, but no real corresponding war to justify it by historic terms. And actually, if we look at the line as we move through the first part of the 21st century, it actually looks as steep as it was during the world wars, which by historical precedent is something that we need to be very mindful of when we think about this discussion and the trajectory that we're on and whether or not it is sustainable.
Okay, brilliant. I think this is a really important discussion. I really like the way that you framed it as well. And one thing, I suppose, my role in this will be a kind of gentle rebuttal, I think. It's a kind of like, perhaps calmer Zach Polanski. That's the role that I'm going to be playing, perhaps. But just to push back on the kind of debt framing, I suppose some responses that people would give to this focus is to say, well, Britain has had high debt before. It had high debt in the 1950s, and it built the NHS. And there was a, so there's a kind of social reason for that. And our debt compared to other countries, so we're running at about the same level as Canada, around about the same level as France. Japan, for example, runs at 260% of GDP. So I wonder if you could, its debt level, and just to distinguish as well, I think we should just, I think this is true of lots of people, the difference between debt and deficit, because Zach Polanski actually did get this wrong recently. The debt is the cumulative money owned by a country, and the deficit is just running against the difference between spending and income and revenue. Yeah. And there's both of those, I think, on the graph. So it's debt that we're kind of talking about now. But why do you think that debt is such a problem when other countries such as Japan run at a higher level of it?
It's a problem because of the amount of interest the UK has to pay on its debt, which is actually the markets think that the UK is on an economic trajectory, which means that our interest rates are higher than in some comparable countries. The markets don't trust the UK to be able to pay back its debt in the same way that they trust France, even though France's national debt is higher. They don't trust the UK, they don't trust this country to pay back its debt in the same way that they trust Japan to pay back its debt, despite the fact I think Japan's national debt to GDP ratio is actually double what the UK is. Yeah. And that means that we're in a position where, and I appreciate debt conversations are a bit boring, but that means that actually the interest that we're paying on our debt is higher than we're spending on some government departments, like education, for example.
And I just kind of want to get into that a bit, because I think it's something when we have these debates, as I have, we reach for these vertical examples in time and horizontal ones in space. But why is it that Britain has a kind of poorer borrowing credibility than those other countries? What has happened to this country to mean that it's in a more vulnerable position? Perhaps Japan is a kind of unique case because it has a strong bond market, it has a very powerful sovereign bank. But what's the difference with somewhere like France or Canada? Why are we, in your mind, like uniquely badly placed to have a high borrowing?
Well, I think Japan is quite an interesting one, because a lot of their debt obligations they're not necessarily funded by the markets in the same way that it is in the UK. A lot of it is based on Japanese assets, so homes that Japanese people own. Also, the savings rate in Japan is a lot higher than in the United Kingdom. So their economic makeup is a little bit different. But when it comes to what I think is different about the UK context is that we have really, since 2008, had a pretty stagnant economy, stagnant productivity rates. Public spending has been going up as a result of demographic changes, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail, but we've got an aging population and a shrinking labour force. And it's very difficult to see how that changes over time. And, I work in finance, and I know that if you look at a business's trajectory and their ability to pay back debt, and if I was to look at the UK as a business over the since the 2008 financial crash, would I lend the UK money? Probably not. And if I did lend the UK money, I would put a heavy interest rate on that loan to make sure that I got my money back. I'm just going to take my coat off because I'm a bit warm.
Okay. Yes, it's quite hot in here, and it's very humid outside. Okay, and it's a very nice coat, I might say. Is it woolen?
It is wool.
Yes, it looks very good.
Yeah,
Sometimes sweat is the price you have to pay to look good. So yeah, I can fan you if you like.
Oh,
we could debate whilst fanning each other.
Oh
yeah.
gosh, it's getting very exciting. It's getting hot on this stage.
Exactly. Brilliant. Okay, and one thing I wanted to kind of get into with this is this. Whether or not, I mean, just to ape, at the moment, obviously, there's a rise in populist left-wing arguments about the economy. Zach Polanski is articulating them very well, I think, as is Gary Stevenson, who wrote The Trading Game, and other economists such as Grace Blakely as well. And the point that they'd come back to with this, I think, they'd say to you, your position is an ideological position. They'd say you're focused on neoclassical economics, you're thinking about trying to cut debt, to cut spending, to stimulate growth. But actually, the thing that you need to do in order to get the economy moving is redistribute wealth, and you need to channel money down to the poorest, lower-income members of the population, because data shows that they're more likely to spend their income. You know, you give money to rich people, they put it into assets, it monopolizes at the top, it pools there. You regenerate wealth down to the bottom, and it stimulates and things move. And one of the reasons we've had a stagnated economy is exactly because of this framing, because in 2010, after the financial crisis, George Osborne came in and gave us austerity. And he said, what we need to do now is cut. Whereas maybe what he should have done is bought into Gordon Brown's book and focused on fiscal stimulus to get things moving, rather than cutting public services, which not only made people poorer, which has a moral problem and lets down our obligations to members of the population, but also has an economic cost of stagnation. Oh, thanks. Thanks.
Well, let's dig into austerity, shall we? And actually have a look at some of the figures from around 2010, 2011 until 23, 24. So the NHS budget in real terms increased by 40 to 45% in that period. And we all know how badly the NHS is performing at the moment. We also know that that pensioner benefits...
Sorry, I missed that statistic. Did you say the budget increased by 40%?
The NHS budget increased by 40 to 45%.
During the coalition government? During
the period of what you might call austerity.
Okay.
We also saw pensioner benefits increase massively, about a 70% rise over that period over the same period of what you might call austerity. Of course, the coalition government brought in the triple lock-in pensions, which has increased the value of a pension by 89% over that same period. So we can talk about austerity. Well, actually, what happened during austerity is that the state spent more, but not as quickly as it would have done before austerity. Now, I'm not saying that there were not some negatives that came with spending less money during that period. But the simple fact of the matter is we're on a trajectory where our age-related spending commitments, so that's things like pensions, that's things like NHS spending, that's things like adult social care, that's also things like SEND at the moment, which is becoming a huge problem at the other end of the spectrum.
What's SEND, sorry?
Special educational needs.
Okay.
So children with special educational needs, that has gone up multiples, especially since the pandemic. And what might happen by the middle of this century, Robin, and you and I will both be alive in the middle of the century, is that we might actually, fingers crossed, if we don't all die of war first, but we'll come to that later on.
Or sweat.
Or sweat, is that we might actually default on those obligations, because entitlement-related spending is out of control, and whenever people try to tighten up the criterion for this entitlement-related spending, everyone says, "Oh, we couldn't possibly make."
Just clarify entitlement-related spending.
So, for example, as a British citizen, you are entitled to a state pension. Right, okay. You are entitled to the winter fuel allowance. Mm-hmm. You are entitled to healthcare free at the point of use. You are entitled, if you've got a child with special educational needs, to certain levels of benefits. And the point that I'm making is that the trajectory that we're on when it comes to entitlement-related spending is not sustainable, and we might default on those obligations by the middle of the century if we carry on the trajectory that we're on. And then whenever a government tries to tighten up the criterion for entitlement-related spending, and we'll just talk about the winter fuel allowance, because that's a recent one that lots of people on both the left and the right were outraged by, and I do not know why people on the right especially were outraged by it, is that when they try to introduce what I would describe as quite a sensible means testing of the winter fuel allowance, everyone complained that it was cruel.
I suppose the left argument to that would be that the problem isn't about spending on welfare, it's about not taxing the right people. And the response that comes back a lot is tax wealth, not income. And that we tax income very heavily and we tax wealth quite poorly and quite lowly comparatively. And the story of the last 30 years is a huge growth in the price of assets, houses in particular, and a decrease in real wages. And coupled with that, there's been a massive expansion in wealth for the very few, and billionaires have kind of doubled their wealth by 1,000% or something. So I suppose I want to just kind of see if you can engage with that response that is getting a lot of flavour and support at the moment. For example, the argument that we should tax. Rachel Reeves kind of made a nod towards it by putting a tax on houses of over £2 million, a mansion tax. Some people want her to go further. The Greens are arguing there should, and Gary Stevenson and other people on the left, arguing that there should be a tax on assets over 10 million. And that comes back to this point, wealth pooling at the top and capitalism needing an intervention, otherwise it tends towards monopoly without getting too abstract about that. What that means in real terms is cost of living crisis, money focused in assets owned by the rich, and the middle class becoming increasingly immiserated as well.
I think the conversation around tax is a waste of time, to be honest, on both the left and the right.
Okay.
Whether or not you're this kind of person that is like Liz Truss and says we've got to cut taxes massively, or in Reform's last manifesto they spoke about increasing the personal allowance to 20,000 without funding it, or if you're a person that believes that we should have a wealth tax. At the end of the day, yes, taxes are an issue, and the reason that taxes are rising is because we have an ageing population and a shrinking labour force, and also a regulatory framework that makes it very difficult to build the infrastructure and the businesses that enable people to thrive in this country and have a comfortable life and a comfortable cost of living. We can have a conversation about tax. We'll probably disagree on it, and that's fine. But actually, what I think is the more important issue is around what I would say are cost-free, as in revenue-neutral, cash-flow-neutral things that any government can do in order to make the cost of living easier for people in this country. So whether or not we're talking about planning regulations that hold up, not just housing, but hospitals, reservoirs. Does anyone know when the last reservoir was built in this country? Do they think it was before or after I was born? I was born in 1994. Before. We've had a population increase of over 10 million in that period, and we've not built a reservoir. We have one of the wettest countries in the world. It's raining today. I'm wet here on the stage, partially because of the rain, partially because it's hot. And yet we have hosepipe bans in the northwest of this country, which is where my mother is from. It rains all the bloody time. We have hosepipe bans in Manchester because we don't build enough reservoirs. Why don't we build enough reservoirs? Because of planning regulation, because of environmental regulation, partially also because of local democracy. People just block projects in their own country, but in their own backyards rather. But what does that lead to? That leads to droughts, and it leads to water prices being higher. And then you have another situation in London. I live in Chiswick in West London, and we've had this Thames super sewer project, which seems to have been going on forever to build. People were opposing building this super sewer for years. It's been driven up in costs, and at the same time, these are the same people that complain when Thames Water has to release sewage into the Thames because the sewage infrastructure is not up to scratch. And yet they try to build new sewage infrastructure, but people block it.
Okay, yeah, so I let's take that. So there may well be a problem with NIMBYism or not in my backyard type people, and that kind of works both on the left and the right. They're progressive causes and locally fighting for that, but also conservation can be a kind of conservative thing as well. So that I agree that is something in the country that maybe could encourage building if it was liberalised. I suppose the pushback would be, let's take water. We could argue the problem with the water industry is that it was privatised. 1989, water was privatised. £70 billion paid out in dividends to shareholders. That's money that could have been reinvested back in the water to improve infrastructure and maintain what, as are rightly what you say, ailing waterways, ailing provision. So some of the problem is surely in a lack of state intervention here, a lack of state regulation, and a lack of profits being put back into those industries rather than paid out to kind of in dividends to shareholders. So we kind of 70 billion in dividends since 1989 in the water industry, and water bills have increased 40% in real terms. And like, it's easy to blame individuals for this, and it's quite nice to have the catharsis for some people of the CEO of Thames Water or some water company had a citizen's arrest recently. I don't know if you saw that. And in a way, like there is an argument on the left which I sometimes find quite uncomfortable about demonizing the individuals involved, and some of them do pay themselves fat salaries, and that can be quite grotesque. However, they are doing their job. You have a job as the CEO of a company to have an obligation to shareholders, and that is a problem. Maximizing shareholder value rather than maximizing the service for customers is a design flaw in privatization. So surely that means more state intervention rather than less, particularly when it comes to the water industry.
I think it's about what state intervention. I don't think the privatization of water has been a huge success.
Okay.
There will be people that would rightly argue that the privatization of water, the privatization of telecoms, the privatization of railways actually did lead to more investment post-privatization than pre-privatization. That is just something that did happen. Now, is it something which has worked in the long run? I think that's probably still up for debate, but this idea that we'd suddenly privatise utilities and all of our problems would go is for the birds, because the state owners would run into the same problems when it came to expanding or upgrading infrastructure as the private owners are now, only they wouldn't be paying dividends out to shareholders, and fair enough, maybe you don't want that, but I think most people in this room have got a pension scheme. A lot of pension schemes are invested in these privatised utilities. So it's not a silver bullet just to say, oh, if you brought everything back into state ownership, it would all be perfect. There are some people in this room who are old enough to remember what it was like when everything was state-owned. It was not perfect. It's not perfect when it's state-owned. It's not perfect when it's privately owned. There are flaws and benefits in each system. What I'm talking about when it comes to state intervention here is the stranglehold that certain environmental and planning regulations have on companies, individuals, and indeed the state, creating the homes, the infrastructure, the railways, the roads, the power stations that we need in order to have a comfortable cost of living in this country. High Speed 2, for example, is costing 8.5 times per mile than it costs to build high-speed railways across Europe. It costs double to build an ordinary railway in the UK than it does to build equivalent railways in Europe. Roads are more expensive to build here. We have a housing shortage of between 4 million and 6 million, depending on which numbers you look at, whether or not it's the CPS or the Centre for Cities. This is all happening because of regulation that's getting in the way of businesses, individuals, and the state building the infrastructure that we need to reduce the cost of living.
When you say regulation, what are you talking about? Are you talking about, you mentioned local democracy, you mentioned in some places it's conservation, in other places it's health and safety. What's the specific legislation that you think is getting in the way?
Specifically, if I was the Prime Minister tomorrow, I would repeal something called the Town and Country Planning Act, which is basically, it was a piece of regulation that was brought in, I believe, in the early mid-20th century, which essentially created the green belts that we have in this country at the moment. I think that needs to be looked at. We cannot have a situation where, because of regulation that was built, that was introduced in the post-war period, we are now having a present time housing crisis that is impacting not just young people, but people across the generation spectrum and driving up living costs. And if we could reduce the cost of housing, which is the highest outgoing that people have in this country, by one simple measure, changing a regulation. We're not even asking the government to spend more money. We're just asking them to change a regulation to make it easier for private or public house builders to build the houses that we need so that it cheapens it. Then I think that's something the state should do. But the problem is when you propose that to people, all of a sudden people say, oh no, we need our green belt. God forbid we should have our view ruined in Hertfordshire or Cheshire or wherever it is, Wiltshire around Bristol.
Well,
we need these houses to be built.
I mean, there are plenty of people in the architecture community. I know Finn Harper's been doing a lot about this at the moment, and David Mooney, who we had on recently from the London Wildlife Trust, they would argue that there is a place where you can build and conserve nature as well, and those two things aren't mutually exclusive.
I think they are mutually exclusive.
Okay, and you just want to get
I think
yours to nature.
We're at a point. No, but seriously, like how have we come to a point where we care more about bats than we do about babies? I mean, it's ridiculous. You know, we're at a position where our children and our children's children cannot afford housing, and they are at a situation where they are spending thousands on rents, the majority of their incomes on rents or housing costs, and they are leaving the country as a result. This is an emergency.
But there's other things that can happen, right? This ageing population, well, that's because the government need to have an honest conversation across all parties about the fact that if we have an ageing population, we either need to get used to a lower standard of living, or we need to have higher immigration.
We need to have more babies.
Or we need to have more babies. Yes. Or the other thing that we can do around that is make the argument, what we're talking about, higher regulation, yes. I'm actually just realizing the time. Oh yeah, the one point I was just going to make on this before we go to questions, what time are we? Yeah, so having an honest conversation about immigration, about geopolitical corrections, you know, trying to increase economic activity by perhaps rejoining the European Union. We're in a very different kind of space than we were when we had previously high-spending governments. I just want to zoom out slightly before we go to audience questions. Have we not been here before? The conversation that we're having is, as I said at the start, it's an enduring one. It's the same conversation that happened in the late 1970s when we talked about the end of the post-war consensus. We could be having a discussion here between someone who is, you know, putting forward a Keynesian economic theory and you putting more of a neoclassical one. The way that your path leads is to increased inequality, into wealth divides, and that has an impact on society of fracturing and of alienation. Do you not think that the consequences of what you're arguing for, lower state intervention, neoliberalism, we've been there with Thatcher and we know where it ends up?
I mean, you're the one that's been saying neoliberalism, not me. I've just made an argument.
Well, your framing is ideological.
Well, hang on, let me finish my point. I've just made an argument that we should remove the regulatory barriers that artificially inflate the cost of living, whether or not we're talking about energy, transport, water, housing, building infrastructure. Mamdani makes the same arguments that I'm making. So you keep on saying neoliberal. Fine, if that's what you think that it is. But I don't understand how saying, let's remove the regulatory barriers that will cost any government nothing, whether or not it's a Labour government, a Green government, a Tory government, a Reform government, why reforming those regulatory barriers and reducing the cost of living increases inequality. Can you explain to me how you got to that point?
Well, I'm thinking about the broader point about minimum state intervention and focusing on debt rather than necessarily the regulatory environment. So I was broadening out your argument there. I'd love to have a back and forth with you. I don't want to just have the final word, but we've only got a few questions.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.